And also for me, how I'm here today is I have been working with Hunt in a professional capacity, but when we talked about this topic, this is one that's particularly passionate to me because I'm in recovery from an opioid use disorder. And it was a part of that journey, even though psychedelics weren't a part of my initial healing. It was something that I learned about through my own exploration and research into the topic of substance use disorders. And before we get started, I just want to frame for a second the gravity of what we are facing when we're talking about substance use disorders in the United States today. Because chances are you have seen different stories in the news about the overdose crisis, about what's happening with addiction. But sometimes it's hard to put into words and conceptualize just how large this challenge is right now. And so to give you a little bit of a sense, I was recently at church and we were having our Sunday school class and talking about formational experiences for different generations and talking about the Great Depression, the Spanish flu, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, the rise of HIV/AIDS, 9/11, all of these different experiences. And I was going through and thinking of how many people in my generation would name the overdose crisis. Because if we look back at these numbers, more people have died as a result of the overdose crisis than here in the United States, than every American who died in every war fought in the 20th century. Right now, we are on pace to have more people die on average every year from drug overdoses than Americans who died on each year during World War II. Put it in another framework, and not just overdoses. If we look at 2021, for those under the age of 65, more Americans died last year under the age of 65 from alcohol-related causes than COVID-19. And so when we look back at this period years from now, because I trust at some point, we are going to figure out the public policy that has caused this overdose crisis. That's a whole other webinar, but this was not inevitable. This was caused by bad public policy. This was caused by the war on drugs. We're going to look back someday at this period of time and realize that this was a shaping moment for a generation and that it dramatically shifted our demographics when right now the leading cause of death for those under 45 are fentanyl overdoses, not just overdoses in general, but just fentanyl overdoses. So that's the scale of what we are working with. And if you work in the field of addiction treatment or substance use disorders, you also know the other challenging reality is that treatment doesn't always work, or it doesn't always work the first time. And that for a lot of different addictions, our rates of success when measured by abstinence 6 months out, a year out, aren't always very good. And there hasn't been a lot that's happened in the past few decades to significantly change that. Most of the medical interventions that we've had, things like methadone or buprenorphine, those have been around for a while, and there's some good work happening on expanding access. But as far as switching those numbers, we have been in a stagnation period of trying to find new ways of addressing some substance use disorders. And so wasn't planning on sharing too much of my story tonight, but with our last minute shifts, I want to give you a little bit more background on my story and how I came to find out about this. I was hospitalized over 10 years ago with a mild case of pancreatitis. At the time, they were wondering why somebody in the 20s had pancreatitis. Well, they found out, but they found out through using a procedure that ended up causing acute necrotizing pancreatitis. So I went from a pretty painful condition that they weren't sure why. They found out I had an abnormally formed duct, But in that process, I ended up in the ICU in acute respiratory distress. And it wasn't long before the doctors said to my family, you better get in here because it's time to say goodbye. I was very lucky. After a couple of months in the hospital, I stabilized, but I was sent home on heavy doses of both fentanyl and hydromorphone. Fentanyl is something that you've heard a lot about in the news. Hydromorphone's an opioid that's more potent than what we call diacetyl morphine, or its street name is heroin. So I was sent home on a lot of opioids and developed an opioid use disorder. And I was so lucky because at that point, normally the story is somebody's prescriptions start running out and they have a doctor who confronts them, gets angry with them, blames them, shames them, and then cuts them off from their prescription. I was so lucky to have a completely different experience, a doctor who responded with empathy, who responded with understanding the fact that I was still in pain. And that's why I had been using the medication. And that's how I ended up in this place in the first place. And that he was willing to partner with me through outpatient therapy in order to address my opioid use disorder. And so I didn't tell this story for years because I had felt that shame around it. We've made some good steps around addressing mental health and addressing some of the stigma there, but it is still real. And we can talk about not having stigma out there. And then as soon as it happens for you, or if it happens to someone you love, or it happens with your family, all that shame can come pouring in. But that was where I first started researching more about understanding addictions, because my perception of addiction had been so formed by this idea of the intervention, right? Where you sit someone down in a circle and you let them know exactly how bad they are and how much they need to change, or you have the scared straight, or you hear these stories of it's like, well, we got to send people to prison because that's the only way they'll get off. And this entire narrative that is based off of this idea that what we need is more punishment, more harm for somebody in the midst of a substance use disorder. And I knew that graded against my understanding of faith, that graded against my understanding of how God operates in this world. But I didn't know that actually all of the best scientific research out there shows that those harsh confrontations are not only ineffective, they are actually likely to have a backlash effect. And so as I'm diving into these numbers, diving into this research, my only view of psychedelics had been what I had heard growing up in my evangelical upbringing. And so I'd heard a few stories about like this crazy guy, Timothy Leary. He sounded like a wacko, had no interest in that. Then I had heard about some people going to fish concerts and dropping acid and said, well, that sounds fine for them, but that's not any interest to me. And then I came across this study from Johns Hopkins, and it was around smoking cessation. And I had known that smoking was one of the hardest addictions to kick. And in any given year, it's highly unlikely that anyone is going to stop smoking. It's about 55% of smokers attempted, but only 8% achieved any kind of abstinence 6 to 12 months later. The best pharmaceutical treatment available today for a nicotine addiction maybe has a 35% success rate. And then here was this Johns Hopkins study involving 3 psilocybin sessions combined with cognitive behavioral therapy that had 80% of participants confirmed to have quit smoking at a 6-month follow-up. A subsequent study then had 60% remaining abstinent at over 12 months. And so in hearing all of this, I was just shocked at the efficacy. But then in reading through all of the detailed scientific study, I also saw one line that didn't seem to be highlighted that much or reported a lot of other places. And that was positive results directly correlated to mystical-like experiences. And here was tucked away from me. This is not surprising for all of you who are part of this now, but for me at the time, it blew me away to think that here was a treatment that was based upon people having these kinds of unitive experiences, overwhelming senses of love and connection to the universe. And that it wasn't this logic of the world that said we need to punish more, we need to harm more in order to get people to change. It was saying if people have these experiences where they know love and grace and truth in a way they haven't before, we can clinically track the positive effects of that session. And it turns out this was not entirely new. Once again, I started diving into this completely disconnected from the rest of the history of the research that had been going on, and started to find out that in the 50s and 60s that this was one of the primary areas researchers were interested in, was treating substance use disorders. And going back further than that, there was Bill Wilson, founder of AA, who tried LSD and said, yes, this is the kind of experience, not that will fix everything, not that it will be a magic bullet, but can provide a catalyzing moment for others to take those initial steps that they need into a supportive community and the relationships that they might need to sustain a new way of being and living in their lives. And one of the fun things is, Bill Wilson said this was exactly like this experience that he had first had that brought him to found AA in the first place. And I went back in the AA literature, and a lot of the AA historians said, well, we know about this piece of Bill Wilson's history. And the kind of the unofficial AA historian said, and we talked about whether we should just write it out of the AA history entirely. Just not mention it, not bring it up again. Let's not talk about this. But we want to do it because we want to be able to show that Bill Wilson was a man who had his flaws and sometimes got things wrong. Because they wanted to separate out and said, what happened with Bill Wilson initially, this moment where he had this great white light vision, and he imagined a great chain of people all in this mutual aid supporting one another. That is a true mystical experience that comes from God. Whatever's happening with LSD, psilocybin, that's something else. Let's not introduce that. That was the argument that a lot of these AA historians made. But there was another part of Bill Wilson's story that has now come out. Because when Bill Wilson had that initial experience, he was trying what was called the belladonna cure. And he was drinking a brew made from belladonna and nightshade, which, for those of you who know your natural plant pharmacology, are not particularly, I wouldn't recommend anyone try them. They're not particularly consistent in their effects, but they are psychedelic plants. And so this idea of this dichotomy between somehow God acts in this one way and it's legitimate, and it's not God if it's over in this place, I think it's a question that there's still a lot of theological categories that I think we can tease out as a community and we want to talk to about more. But increasingly, we're seeing those sorts of divides blur. And it was for me soon after that, without knowing the history of the psychedelic movement, I found out a friend was cultivating psilocybin mushrooms at home. And on a Good Friday, I cleared my calendar and said, this seems like an auspicious day to have my first own experience. And that opened me up to a new way of understanding substance use disorders. It opened me up to a new way of understanding myself, and has been an important tool for me in sustaining my own kind of recovery. And that's where I also am excited about talking about this inside of recovery communities, because my recovery doesn't look like everybody else's. And I love that that's the case. My recovery looks different, and I hope that we continue to allow a lot of different ways of addressing recovery and approaching recovery. And my hope is that the world of treating substance use disorders is moving into today where cancer treatment moved over 50 years ago. Because initially with cancer treatment, there was this idea that there was a universal mechanism of action that caused cancer. And so what researchers were looking for was a universal cure for that cancer. But what helped push forward cancer research and is beginning to proliferate today in research around substance use disorders is not looking for a universal cure, not looking for one thing that's going to be a magic bullet, but looking to address the diversity of substance use disorders. And just like we now in cancer research, we aren't trying to cure cancer writ large. We're trying to develop therapies for an increasingly specified different kinds of cancers, so that in the terminology, N equals 1. We want to get that cure to the place where it's specified to the individual. And that's what I hope this move is in addressing substance use disorders. Psychedelic-assisted therapy isn't going to be for everyone. It isn't going to be a magic bullet that will automatically cure everything, but it's going to be one more tool that we have to create these catalyzing experiences that pushes back on our dominant societal logic that violence and force is what changes the world, and creates a new space for these experiences of transformation that occur through love and connection to others. So wanted to introduce myself that way, tell some of my story, and then also pull in Reverend Andrea Smith and talk and have her speak to us a little bit about what this has looked like in her local ministry context, as she's in a community that is hard hit by addiction as well.
Thank you. My experience began 5 to 6 years ago when I learned about the study with Johns Hopkins from my son, who was in college in upstate New York. Prior to that, honestly, I'd never heard of, other than like talking about the 70s and psychedelics, that's all I knew about psychedelic work. And so he sent me a link and he said, "Hey, Mama, I think this would be a great idea for you." And it was about clergy participation in a study with Johns Hopkins. And so I started researching what the study was. It said it was around psychedelic use, and it was to see what religious professionals would think after, because the research was being done to treat addiction. And I personally was interested because they mentioned stage 4 cancer patients. And in my line of work over the past 25 years, I can't, tell you the number of people that I have been able to walk with in that part of their journey from the life here to the life eternal. And so that's what piqued my interest. And then I started talking with the scientists and the folks at Johns Hopkins, and I realized that this was much bigger than anything I could have ever imagined. And it started using words like LSD and all that kind of stuff. I grew up a good Southern Baptist girl, so those words made me cringe. I'm like, oh my gosh, LSD? I can't do anything that's going to be related to LSD. But by this time, I was so far in with the conversations with the folks from Hopkins, I didn't want to pull out, but I went in with a lot of, just trepidation and anxiety. But over the year and a half that I was in conversation with them prior to the experiences and those one-on-one sessions with my 2 guides, I became so aware that what the drug actually did was suspend time and space for us so that we could go to our deeper levels of consciousness, which as a faith believer, a follower of Jesus, a worshiper of the divine, we believe that can happen in lots of different ways, with meditation, with prayer. But it was just an easier pathway, perhaps for some that were able to do that. So that's how I got into all this. I'm going to give you like a 2-minute version of just my life history, because that is why I'm so passionate about this research and its use in the lives of people who are really wrestling with addiction. Over the past 10 years, 12 years ago, I was asked to found a church in the United Methodist denomination from our conference leaders. And so they wanted us to launch a church that would reach people that were never going to darken the doors of a traditional church. So I had the luxury and privilege of creating a context and a culture that was very open-minded. And here in in North Carolina in the Deep South, that's a rare thing, a church where all means all, and we really mean that. And so because of that, we did attract young men and young women who were dealing with opioid addiction. And so over the last 12 years, I've buried 10 different people, either suffering from an overdose or from taking their own life because of just dealing with the struggles and the difficulties that come with all those things. So that's the tail end of the story. Now I need to tell you just briefly the middle. When I went into my experience with Johns Hopkins, you know, I really had no idea the transformation that could come from that. And as a faith person, the word salvation, if you translate that in scripture, can mean transformation. And so this just came holistically to me and came in just a perfect understanding when I went through my journey with the first and the second dose at Hopkins. I have had a very and I've only learned recently to use the word traumatic past. I was at the time of my birth separated from my mom. She developed a septic infection and was hospitalized for the first year of my life and ended up having a heart valve replacement. And back in 1970, that was a really rare thing. So for the first year of my life, I was passed around from lots of different people. So I didn't experience that deep mirroring that comes from us in relationships with others. And so then my mom suddenly died when I was 9 in the middle of a church worship service. She was our teacher, and we were having a little commencement Bible school service, and my little group was up on the stage, and she suffered from a cerebral aneurysm. And that happened in the middle of a lot of people. And I was up on the stage, and that within itself was traumatic. And then my father remarried in less than a year. And at my stepmother's age of 55, she did not sign on for a 9-year-old little girl. She was not really interested in that. So the next 10 to 12 years were difficult at best. I went through a lot of body shaming, fat shaming, and despite her own battles with morbid obesity per the scientific definition, it was a troubled childhood and adolescence. I dealt with eating disorders, just lots of stuff. And we didn't know about therapy or chose not to pursue that path. And so anyway, I was pretty messed up going into adulthood. Then felt a calling to ministry. I've always grown up in the faith, and so followed that calling to ministry after a brief career in the field of education, and got married, lived 25 years, and came to find out literally a couple of weeks before my Johns Hopkins experience that what I had known to be true in my marriage was not reality. And because of prejudices that exist in our society towards folks that deal with identity around sexual orientation, that my husband had been living a very dual life and no longer could identify in such a way that he would be able to keep our covenant with one another. And that literally happened 2 weeks before my experience at Johns Hopkins. And so going into that experience, my guides were like, "Are you really sure we should do this? Or maybe we should wait because this is a lot." And I'm like, "No, we've been doing the soul work and the mental work and the emotional work leading into this. And so I feel like God, the divine, will lead this where it needs to be." And honestly, it was through my experience with Hopkins that I learned about, the deep effects that all those things had on me, but the beauty that can come from deep healing and from transformative healing, and recognizing and addressing and going in and through my fears of abandonment, my fears of not being enough, my fears of just all the stuff that comes along with absolute low self-esteem and feeling like, I'm not worthy. The very beginning of my experience, I was completely alone. So I addressed my feelings of abandonment and had to face them. And then I noticed this beautiful couple on a dance floor with, dancing and ballroom dancing, which is not even anything I've ever been interested in. And I'm like, okay, this is odd. There's people dancing and they just look like this beautiful, grace-filled couple. And so then I go through this whole experience and I just see the universe and beauty and creation and feel at one with God, which is what we believe atonement is all about anyway. And so at the end of my experience, I noticed that I was standing up on top of a mountain after confronting my own physical death and resurrection. And I realized, wait a minute, oh my gosh, like me standing up on that mountain was the same individual that I saw at the beginning of my psychedelic journey that had no face, but yet was full of beauty and full of grace. And weeping in my experience, I said out loud at the end, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm that person. I'm that person at the very beginning that is created by love and is beautiful both outside and within. And I would have never, ever said those words about myself and still wouldn't. Although I do have a deep place in my soul that now I can go to and know that the divine is love and knits us together in our mother's womb, and we're all beautiful. And so healing comes in death to our ego and death to all the stuff that comes along with that. And resurrection is absolute new life. And Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is both yet to come and here and now. And I'm an advocate for helping all people experience the kingdom of heaven here and now. And I believe that psychedelic research enables that to happen. One of the first young men that became a part of West Church here in North Carolina, he battled opioid addiction. He watched his mother die over years. She had brain cancer. And he shared with me about some clinical work that was being done in Mexico and asked me if I would help him get there if he raised the money. And come to find out after talking with Hunt, what he was doing was going to Mexico and being treated with psychedelics. And he overcame his opioid addiction because of the treatment that he was able to receive in Mexico. I baptized him. He was the first professing believer we had at West Church. And then he became a huge advocate for telling other people that, hey, church doesn't have to be this bad thing that you think it is. It actually can reach people in a way that is non-threatening and real and relevant. And watching Kai truly be born again, experiencing that, and then experiencing it for myself for much different reasons. I will be an advocate for this research as long as I have voice to do so.
Thank you so much. It's powerful to hear your own journey and also what you're doing in that faith community. And we do have Peter Hendricks here as well, who is a researcher at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and is doing some fantastic and innovative work on addressing substance use disorders with psychedelic-assisted therapy. We're going to turn it over to him to give us some of that scientific perspective on what's happening and why this is so promising. Peter, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Some of you I know, and I won't call you out, but it's good to see some of the faces or the names that I recognize. This is a really interesting group, and I have to say I'm very glad to be speaking to you all, because it's not always that I can really share the complete story about my interest in this line of work. But I often say, like many of us, my story starts with my mother, who raised me and is the reason I'm here today. My mother is from very rural North Carolina, and she was raised Southern Baptist, but as an adult, as a young adult and a student at UNC Chapel Hill, decided to become Catholic. And being raised by a convert is pretty serious, because she was pretty serious about her faith, and I suppose I then was too, and remain so today. And my first introduction to psychedelics was through the research literature. I went to the University of Virginia. When I graduated, I was in a volunteer organization called the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. the Jesuits are an order, a Catholic order priest, and the Pope was a Jesuit before he became the Pope. And I worked at a homeless shelter in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. It was actually run by a Russian Orthodox community. And at that time, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with my life, but saw that for many of the residents of the shelter, addiction was a common thread, and it was either the reason for their situation or certainly exacerbated it. So I decided to pursue a career in the addiction field and found myself in Florida, of all places, after having been in San Francisco studying smoking cessation as a model for addiction, and then later finding my way back in San Francisco as a postdoc at UCSF. And my dissertation, I've told this story many times, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but my dissertation was published in a journal called Psychopharmacology. And at the time, I hadn't seen my name in print many times. So a complimentary copy was sent to my office, and it was wrapped in plastic wrap. And I opened it up, excited to see my name in print. And I instead opened to Roland Griffith's now groundbreaking article in 2006 on the effects of psilocybin in healthy volunteers. And I was really just transfixed. I think at the time, I really couldn't believe what I was seeing. I'm from the DC area. My father was an attorney in the Department of Justice. He would not have been a drug warrior, I should say, but when you're from that part of the world, it seems like the messages from the federal government are amplified. So I was raised in the 80s during the Reagan administration, and the sort of what you could argue, at least in some ways, was the peak of the war on drugs. So my assumption, even as a postdoc there at UCSF, was that hallucinogens were dangerous, potentially addictive, because that's what their placement in Schedule I would mean. But this article really challenged the way I felt about this class of substance, and this began my fascination with this class of substance, in part because what I was reading was that there is a compound, a drug molecule out there in nature that can elicit the same sort of experiences that I'd read about as a student. I should mention I went to a Catholic Jesuit school, high school. The same experiences I read about with Catherine of Siena, or Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, and others. Hildegard of Bingen. I actually should show you all a little portrait of Hildegard here on my wall, because some of her reports are just, so there it is, so profound. And what a mystic she was, and a scholar. So to realize, wait a second, now we have a compound that can elicit these sort of experiences, and that would mean clinically we could schedule them. They could take place at a certain time in a certain place so as to maximize their therapeutic value. I was really fascinated at this idea. And I brought the idea to my postdoctoral mentor, a very well-established smoking cessation scientist there at UCSF. And I'm so grateful for her, and I love her, but she nearly laughed me out of her office, said that I'd have to wait for another time to pursue this line of work. So after I completed my time there in San Francisco, I moved to Alabama. I went on the job market. I ended up here at UAB. I'm in Birmingham, sorry, not Tuscaloosa. And I started pursuing this line of work again, and trying to gain some allies who could support me in my what was at the time a crazy idea. And fortunately found some very open-minded physicians who wanted to help me in my quest. And fortunately, they had a lot of experience with ketamine, so this wasn't too far afield. But also, unbeknownst to me, the famous Humphrey Osmond's last academic home was here at UAB, and Humphrey Osmond coined the term psychedelic, and he was right here. Also, I didn't know at the time, but Timothy Leary went to the University of Alabama. That's where he got his undergraduate degree. So Alabama's got a long history. Timothy Leary, he was kicked out of West Point, and I think he finished his degree via correspondence because he was sneaking into the girls' dorms in Tuscaloosa, which was a no-no at the time. So I have been, since 2016 or so, conducting a trial of psilocybin in the treatment of cocaine use disorder. And we have some trials that are about to begin. One evaluating psilocybin for smoking cessation, and psilocybin in the treatment of fibromyalgia, and others. I have many irons in the fire, which is what we're asked to do as academics, though I'm somewhat regretting being involved in so many projects, but I'm really excited about what psychedelics might do Though I should contextualize this, most treatments for addiction, the success rates are quite low. As Timothy mentioned, if I gave someone the best smoking cessation treatment money could buy, if 20 to 30% of these folks quit smoking, I would have done a pretty good job. And my hope is with psilocybin, we could bump those success rates up maybe to 50 or 60%. So we'd see a really nice improvement in our efficacy, though I don't think we'll have something that works for everyone because nothing ever does. But I'm really excited to be doing this, and I'd be happy to share with you some anecdotes from some of the participants in our trial. And because I'm in the Deep South, most, if not all of our participants, there are a few exceptions, are very explicitly religious and Christian, and the experiences are certainly religious in nature. And I often joke that I've probably spent now hours of my life sitting in a chair watching someone who's wearing blindfolds and earphones, repeating again and again, "Thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus." But it's really wonderful to see that. And there are some certainly stories of transformation that have made just doing the research study alone very much worth the energy and effort that we put into the project. So I'm very excited about where this might go, but I would say cautiously optimistic. I'm not sure how I feel about some of these legalization initiatives. Like anything, there are going to be drawbacks. There are going to be risks associated with any behavior. So the future is an interesting place. I think we'll have to see what unfolds, but I am very excited, like the others who've spoken here today.
Thank you, Peter. Very encouraging to hear and to get this from a few different sides, from pastoral and the scientific, and also seeing these things meet together in the middle. Do want to be sure to open this up to some questions and comments from the rest of the folks who are here today. So if you do have a question, feel free to use that reaction button at the bottom, and it'll have a little raise hand. So feel free to do that at any time and we'll get to you. But as we're waiting for some folks or feel free to put a question in the chat. Peter, do you want to go back to you and talk about that connection between religiosity and religious experience and the healing piece of it? So we've got some of these hypotheses around neuroplasticity and parts of the brain connecting. So feel free to lead us through that, but also where this kind of pushes some of the boundaries of typical clinical research and stretches, I think, some of our scientific language in how exactly we're seeing this healing occur.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned neuroplasticity. I mean, that's something of a buzzword, and I realize it sounds pretty cool to think that a drug could lead to neuronal growth, that it could lead to actual physical changes in the brain, but just about everything does. Cocaine use will result in neuroplasticity. It's just the bad kind. It seems that psychedelics also might lead to some neuroplasticity, but perhaps the good kind. It's hard to say how to think about that, but it seems encouraging, especially because there might be a fair degree of neuroplasticity in a short amount of time. So that could be reflective of what sometimes people refer to as quantum change. So, most change is very gradual, is sort of linear, and it takes a lot of time. But every now and then, people can have experiences in which they experience these quantum leaps. And often these sort of quantum leaps occur in the context of a religious-like experience, which is, precisely why we have a term like epiphany, and why so many, I think, religious people are interested in this line of work, is that it overlaps really nicely with, say, the conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus, that someone could, in almost an instant, be transformed. And from a scientific perspective, that you might see some evidence of that transformation in a fairly dramatic amount of neuroplasticity that appears to be positive is really quite exciting. I think what really is at the heart of this, perhaps, is in many mental health conditions, there is a sort of narrowing of the field of, what's the best way of putting this? I'm trying not to use jargon. Maybe a narrowing in one's field of experience, in one's sort of cognitive field. So I've said before that for many people who are really suffering, in the case of substance use disorders, they might find that every day they're thinking about the substance, how to obtain it, when they're going to use it. They're going to be thinking about their urge or withdrawal symptoms and how to alleviate them. And in very severe cases, that is just a daily experience, such that one's life is experienced through the lens of obtaining and using the drug at the expense of everything else that matters, perhaps ultimately matters more. When people have these mystical type experiences, it appears that field of awareness, that cognitive field of awareness, is opened in a very dramatic way. So if, at one point you were experiencing reality by looking through a straw, it's as though someone's taken that straw away from your eyes. Or, perhaps it would be like witnessing the night sky unfiltered, without any light pollution for the first time, or seeing the ocean for the first time. Suddenly your field of awareness is extraordinarily broadened. And in that moment, people can feel very, very small. And feeling very, very small and maybe even overwhelmed, it seems to align nicely with a term that I've heard some of you used. I think Hunt may have mentioned this when we met here in Birmingham, and that was Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. Was that you, Hunt? Yes, it was. This idea that when you're in the presence of something so large and outside of your understanding, which for I think many of us is consistent with the notion of God, that it can be both amazing, lead to a sense of wonder, but it can also be very frightening. And, for many of my participants who are very explicitly Christian, as I try to prepare them for the experience, it's a challenge because it's so unlike anything they might have experienced before. But I sometimes mention somewhat jokingly, what do the angels typically say when they make an appearance to people in the New Testament? The first thing they say is, don't be afraid. But typically people are terrified, even in the presence of benevolent, messengers of God. And I think there can be a very, very, terrifying element to this experience. And I think that's the way it should be. So you're in the presence of something that's so novel and so outside of your understanding that you're able to make some novel connections, some insights. You have some aha moments, but also for that period of time, that focus, which was so directed toward the self, is alleviated. And that allows people the freedom to think outside themselves for a period of time and have these very profound insights where they might realize, in the case of addiction, that their behavior has impacted adversely people they really care about. And so, an analogy that works quite well is Ebenezer Scrooge, somebody who's just fixated on money. And after having this experience, which was really quite unique, he realizes, I am harming the people I love. I'm harming my employees and their family members. And this isn't about me. I'm not the only person who matters in this existence here on Earth. Other people matter too, and I need to be a better citizen of humanity, I should say. And again, this is really interesting because this seems to comport very well with my own understanding of the Christian God, and that is that ultimately we're here not just for ourselves but for each other. We're in this together. Our fates are intertwined, and to use a rather well-known song that would be sung in Catholic churches every Sunday, we are all one body in Christ. We're all in this together. And I think that sort of profound realization can also have a profound impact on behavior, because when you're using, say, cocaine on a regular basis and you think the only impact is on your own health or your own future, it may not seem as much of a problem as when you realize it impacts everybody around you, including the people you really love.
Thank you, Peter. And we've got a couple of questions here in the chat. One is specifically from Ron. We're discussing right now a very clinical therapeutic use of psychedelics. We're bringing up a lot of indigenous uses around group ceremonies, and looking for comment on use of psychedelics in a more spiritual context, and specifically referencing Bill Richards and sacred knowledge, retreat type setting. Andrea, if you were thinking all of our laws have changed, things have opened up, what could you imagine something like this looking like for a church community that is consistent with the healing mission of the church, and could be a way for this community to grow. And then Peter, a question after that to go back to you is specifically, there's a question around the use of ketamine and if there's any research being done around ketamine and addressing substance use disorders. So Andrea, can you go first?
Yeah. I had no idea how much people actually know about this. Some of the parishioners at West, I've learned over the past 4 years, have participated. They've gone to South America or they've gone to other regions in the world and been a part of a very spiritual group experience with a shaman. And I've listened to their stories. And so I believe that psychedelic use is not just, as Peter mentioned, like it needs to have some boundaries and parameters around it, but with conversation and with great intentionality around it and in preparation, for what you might encounter when you go into those sacred spaces and understanding the theological framework that can be around it, the in and through. If you see something that is a barrier for you, darkness, evil, a demon, however it personifies itself, that you don't run from it, which is also very scriptural, the whole do not be afraid thing, that in the proper setting and context, I do believe it could be integrated into a spiritual community. I don't think it would need to happen every Sunday, but because the power, I think in very intentional, like retreat settings, where people come into it with that desire and that intentionality and doing the work, the meditative work and the preparation for the transformation and catharsis that can happen from within, and being willing to confront our own junk. Some of it is being willing to deal with the hard things. And I perhaps might have had an experience with some folks that have done psychedelics that were not ready to confront their hard stuff. And so it is something that is sacred, and you need to be very intentional about it going into it. But I do believe in the proper context and with conversation and guides, having that spiritual guide there to be that connector and lead in the journey that then enables us to go deep within in a safe space. I think it is very powerful and potential. And honestly, I hope it's my job someday.
I just dropped into the chat a couple of studies, and these are definitely studies. They weren't intended to look at this in particular. So the researchers have lots of footnotes of like this means we need more research on this, but there are some positive indications of psilocybin use outside of any kind of therapeutic context in particular, still being associated with significantly decreased opioid use. So there is some research out there of just that correlation. Still needs a lot more research there, but wanted to flag a couple studies. And Peter, feel free to comment on that previous question and or the question around ketamine.
Well, okay, so forgive me if I am embarrassing you, but we have an expert, Don Lattin, here, who's written quite a bit about this. So I feel kind of silly attempting to answer that question with Don here. But Don, if I'm sorry if I've blown your cover, but I don't know if you want to say anything before I say anything.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Well, I'm a journalist, and I've suffered with both substance abuse and depression, and I've used ketamine for my depression. But there's a connection, obviously, between depression and substance abuse, and I've found ketamine to be very helpful, more helpful than traditional antidepressants, SSRIs. So, in a sense, if someone who is an alcoholic and a cocaine addict, as I was, I have 16 years sobriety. The ketamine in an indirect way is kind of helping me with my addictive tendencies by helping me with my depression. So they're very connected. And there's been a lot of research around ketamine and depression. The other thing I wanted to mention is, there's a whole 12-step group called Psychedelics in Recovery. I put the link in the chat. And these are people who are not taking psychedelics at 12-step meetings, but they're talking about whether they want to try to use psychedelics to get sober, and if they have used psychedelics to help them in their recovery. So there's a whole network, which is growing very quickly, of 12-step groups that are talking about the use of psychedelics in recovery. So that's something people might want to check out if you're interested.
Thank you,
Don, I
Don.
was
And I
going to say,
realized
you knew a bit
before
about.
just realizing that I should have footnoted Don a few times when I was talking earlier. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I've written a lot about Bill Wilson, the whole Bill Wilson story. I had a book called Distilled Spirits, which came out 12 years ago, which was all about the Bill Wilson, some new material about Bill Wilson and his kind of the secret history of psychedelics in AA. So it's called Distilled Spirits. Subtitle is Getting High Then Sober with a Famous Writer, a Forgotten Philosopher, and a Hopeless Drunk. Bill Wilson was the hopeless drunk. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Don's work, and I'll be very honest that I think it's much better than Michael Pollan's. Not to slight Michael, but Don's work is great. I was also kind of referring to Don's expertise around use in religious context. I think it's certainly interesting, and I mean, there's evidence for this sort of thing taking place for some period of time. We have some contact with the Native American church in Choctaw, Mississippi, where the Choctaw Reservation is. And as part of an ethnographic project, they've allowed us to witness some of it. And I was really quite surprised at how, at least for this particular roadman, who's sort of the monitor or the guide or the facilitator, how evangelical in orientation it was. I mean, it was almost like an evangelical drill sergeant. And while administering the drug, the roadman is also, I don't know quite the word is, but there was like a almost admonishing the participants for not being engaged enough in study of the scripture and sort of a discussion, some direction around how their spiritual lives need to be more engaged with the Christian mission. And it was quite surprising to see. It did not take on this sort of very gentle approach that we've taken in our clinical trials. So I think there are any number of ways that you might see psychedelics used outside of these medical contexts. And that's really interesting because in these medical contexts, things are going to be very tightly controlled. I think in religious contexts, there's probably more freedom to explore different ways of doing this, including in group settings, and probably more potential pitfalls. But I think there's some really exciting avenues there. I was also going to mention that I don't know when these data are going to be published, but a colleague of mine has mentioned a few times in some of his work, he finds that baseline religiosity is a moderator of outcome related to mystical type experiences where more religious people tend to benefit more from these experiences. And you might posit that having a framework to understand these experiences is beneficial, or having a support network where you can discuss your experience and where it might make sense is beneficial. But I think that there's a reason, again, why the religious community is so interested in these experiences and why perhaps religious people might respond very well to them. One thing that's interesting to me too, I wanted to mention is, Michael Winkelmann, some of you might have heard of as an anthropologist, and some of his work would indicate that psychedelics have not always been used in ways that we would think of as positive. I mean, they seem to have played a role in warfare, preparing warriors for warfare, and even played a role in child sacrifice. So, it's probably helpful to acknowledge that past and to say that they've been used in a number of different contexts, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. And what's also really interesting to me too is, as far as we know, psilocybin is essentially a pesticide that the mushroom produces to prevent itself from being eaten, if I can use that language, to prevent itself from being eaten, it seems, by gastropods. So it appears to be a gastropod anti-fetans, which is really interesting. So slugs and snails consume these mushrooms, and it intoxicates them. They wander away. They stop eating the mushroom, and yet when humans ingest it, it has much different effects. And there's something to me that's somewhat humorous about that. And I do believe in God, so I think that if there's some divine plan here, that God also has something of a sense of humor about this. As far as ketamine, by the way, I think ketamine's great. I the problem now is that the only people who can really access high dose ketamine are those who can pay out of pocket, and that's a problem. Esketamine, which is a nasal formulation, is available, but it's a bit different. And then, the other thing about ketamine is it appears to be somewhat time limited, that you need to return to the experience, it seems, on a somewhat regular basis. And so maybe the serotonin 2A agonists like psilocybin are potentially more promising in that their effects seem to be a bit longer. And yeah, as someone mentioned, ketamine can absolutely be addictive. And I mean, there are case reports of people having to have their bladders removed because they use ketamine so frequently.
And one of the interesting pieces here too is thinking about the categories we have today about the distinction between a healing therapeutic use and a spiritual religious use really did not exist in the same way back in the early days of Christianity or in ancient Judaism, in which the public health laws, right, of the Torah were mixed in and administered by the priest. And so these separations that we have today really didn't exist at the time that our sacred texts were written. One piece I've been doing some research on is Cyprian is the church, one of the early church fathers who wrote the longest discourse that we have about the early Eucharist. And he wrote against the water drinkers. There were Christians out there that were only drinking water as a part of their Eucharistic celebrations. And he said that this wasn't okay because the Eucharist was about giving the body new life and healing, as well as this, religious ritual. And I'm not even getting into some of the hypotheses around Brian Murarescu and mortality key, just away from even that discussion. We know that early discussions of the Eucharist were about its health-giving effects. And some of these separations we have today didn't exist back then. So Andrea, I'm thinking specifically for those who might be in ministry right now, what are some new ways that you've been thinking about your connection to healing? Both knowing that you have some expertise, but also you don't want to take over the place of somebody who is trained for that specifically. How has this challenged your notions of your role in that healing work in a community around you?
So I think it's all very personal for the people that are, encountering their own journey, and it's their journey. And so one of the things that I really respected around the people at Hopkins is that, like as soon as I found out what I was getting into, I started, buying books and trying to find TED Talks and that kind of stuff. And Bill Richards said, don't do that. Don't taint your brain with things. Let it just be authentic to yourself. And in the way that I do ministry and approach ministry, period, I don't see myself as the holder of all wisdom and knowledge. I see my role as a pastor as one who can help people encounter the living word of Jesus as interpreted through Holy Scripture and tradition and experience and reason. And so I'm not a dictator. So I would not approach this that way either. I approach psychedelic use as it is sacred in a community and requires training and wisdom and insight from people way smarter than me, so I would never attempt to just go rogue and be like the guru of psychedelic use. I would respect the boundaries of people who have gone before me in this work. And I would always encourage very deep intentionality and clear boundaries and communication and expectations and all that kind of stuff. So I would be very much an advocate for its use, but also, I think it needs to be taken really seriously. It can't just be something that we'd go do, next week in the park.
Thank you. And I know it is already past 8, and I think if that's all right, we could go till 8:15, but wanted to see if there were any more questions or comments before we started to wrap up our time together this evening. And Peter, I'll give you the last question then. As you are looking down the road, don't worry, it won't be a hard one. As you're looking down the road, are there any other areas that you are excited about or seeing particular promise that you'd love to let us know about today?
Oh, wow. I think this is kind of a weird thing for me to be excited about, but when I first, consider when I first started doing this, most of my colleagues here thought that I had lost my mind. Some had even joked that I was the second coming of Timothy Leary. But I should say, I know he was prone to antics, but he was also brilliant and charismatic. I mean, I would be grateful for just a sliver of his intelligence. I just sort of continued with this line of work, but at one point, one of my mentors had said to me that, one concern is that we do this work and then there wouldn't be any industry partner that wanted to bring this to market. And so one concern is we do the work, we show that psilocybin could be effective, but then it's just never available to anyone. Because, in this capitalist society, you need an industry partner to fund the drug development process, which is very expensive. And yes, Anna, good comment. Anna says grow our own. Yes, but if we really want this to be widely available, I think it needs to be available to some in clinics and hospitals, people who wouldn't be interested in growing their own or wouldn't know how. And now there seems to be more than enough industry interest, which is really wonderful, which suggests to me that we're going to see this actually come to market. So then the big question is, how is this going to look in the real world? And that's a really important question. So, these studies are pretty limited in the questions they can answer. That is, maybe one administration of psilocybin could have an impact on depression or substance use disorder or whatever else it might be. But if we're in the real world doing this sort of thing, the question is really, how many administrations might there be, and how would they be paced out? And should you increase the dosage if a patient doesn't respond to their first? Should the next administration take place 2 weeks later? If somebody has a really beneficial experience, should you plan a booster session? Or, was it Alan Watts, Don, who said when you get the message, you hang up the phone? Yeah, okay. So, there are a lot of questions around how we would use this out there in the real world. And I'm really talking about dosing parameters, but really what kind of decisions do clinicians need to make in terms of when to dose, depending on the patient's response and how much to dose. There are a lot of questions there, but I'm really excited in trying to understand how we can maximize the therapeutic benefit. And I think too, there's going to be a future where we take these compounds outside of these medical settings, which are probably not ideal from a set and setting perspective. And it could be great for people to have these experiences safely in natural settings, or as in the Marsh Chapel experiment, like in a religious setting. I think there's a lot of potential there as long as we can attend to safety. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what we do out there in the real world, once we've established safety and efficacy.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you all tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Hunt to finish us out this evening.
Oh man, thanks all to Tim and Peter and Andrea for their commitment and their willingness to be here and to share a lot of their own story and their professional knowledge. I'm always happy. I'm grateful for all the work that's done on the coast in Boston and Berkeley and in New York and Baltimore. And I'm also really glad when there's people from North Carolina and Birmingham, and here where I am in Savannah, and folks in Des Moines and Birmingham and Nashville and all around the country. So this is not a coastal elite enterprise. It's really grassroots, and it's growing, and this is growing because we're having these kind of conversations. And I think in the Christian community, that conversation it's increasing. I promise you it's increasing. And there are going to be a lot of resources for all of us. The Christian Psychedelic Podcast, Clint is on here. He's doing wonderful work. There's just so much that's happening. So for those of you that are part of the Christian tradition, I think do some of your own research, meet the others. That's part of what we're trying to do, is to create these networks of connection and education. So we have 3 events coming up. One, please, and so I ask you to watch our newsletter for this. There's a 3-week Lenten study coming up around psychedelics and mystical experience and Christianity beginning next week. At the end of March, there'll be a short hour-long worship service with some reflection and music kind of toward the end of Lent and toward Easter. We did that at Advent around Christmas. And then there's also a study group that will also be in the newsletter. Tim, what's the date of the next one, or the first one really, with Charles Stang and Rachel Peterson at Harvard?
That is March 21st. Let me make sure I'm getting it right. Yes, March 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern time.
Right. And that, again, that'll be in the newsletter, but that's going to be a regular recurring series too, where we take a piece that's written by someone, in this case, Rachel Peterson at Harvard, who's a divinity student at Harvard, and then with Charles Stang, who's on faculty there and part of the Center for World Religions, and they'll have a dialogue about that, which will include, of course, psychedelics. So watch for those events, local groups that we're starting. So this is a network of people just like us. So thank you all for being here, for your interest, and all that you're doing in your own communities to bring this healing about. As I say, if the church doesn't care about healing, what are we doing? So, and this is one of the tools for healing that is showing such profound results. So thanks to the researchers, to the pastors, to all of you that are out there talking and engaging this. And please just invite the others and stay connected to us through the email and all the other groups we're doing.